folks, I'm Woody and welcome back to the shed for part 2 of making the most of your Minisport. Or any other single-seat aircraft for that matter. In part 1 we looked at the camera equipment available to the air-to-air photographer in a single-seat aeroplane and the limitations of various bits of gear. Now that we've chosen our camera, the next problem is to work out how to point it at the subjects of our movie. Right then, fixing the camera to the aeroplane. This isn't as simple as I'd hoped. If we draw up a wish list of major considerations, then obviously we need to put the camera somewhere so it can see our subject, be that another aircraft, or the scenery, or maybe even for a selfie. Excuse me while I comb my hair. And, or try to look cool. Okay, moving swiftly onwards then, the mounting point needs to be set up in a way that doesn't interfere with the aircraft or how we control it. And this can be a problem in a very small cockpit like this with no proper hardpoints on the wings or fuselage. Also, because the platform we're fixing the camera onto will be moving at some speed, it's going to suffer from engine and airframe vibrations. And if we can go fast enough, some buffeting from the airflow as well. Somehow we need to remove or at least minimize these effects on the video footage that we get. Quite apart from the effects of vibration, it follows that the mounting point must offer some security as well, since it's a bad thing if a camera falls off for all kinds of reasons. It would be nice to be able to control the camera too, either directly by pressing a button or remotely somehow. Can we conserve the battery life by switching off or letting it sleep when not being used? And can we also reliably turn it on again when we want to? Of course, we'd really like to know what the camera's seeing. This is one of the things that makes the whole exercise so much fun. Taking a handful of SD cards home to see what we've managed to record is like opening a lucky dip bag every time. Sometimes everyone's pleased with the day's efforts, sometimes we just have to go and do it all over again. If the unit's mounted in the cockpit, this aspect isn't as difficult since we can at least have a reasonable idea of what's in the viewfinder. Various mounts can be constructed that allow us to reposition the camera to capture the subject, but as I said already, these must be arranged to keep away from the activity necessary just to fly the aircraft. This isn't too hard, and I've experimented with over a dozen possible solutions. Some options are shown here and have the great advantage of being controlled by digits, not digital means. In other words, I don't have to rely on a touchscreen, which if you wear gloves can be a bit of a pain. The crane mount, or whatever you want to call it. I can position this to get a more or less clear view through the canopy, and the support arm absorbs a lot of the engine vibration. I try to keep reflections to a minimum by shooting between 60 and 90 degrees to the perspex if I can. If I adjust it right, I can use my throttle arm to provide a bit of extra steadying, so much so that I can use the camera's optical zoom, which otherwise wouldn't be possible without camera shake ruining everything. If I was planning on a lot of use of this mounting, I'd remove the mirror to get rid of the danger of focusing on the edge of it, as we saw in part 1. You might think that it would be obvious if this was happening by looking at the monitor screen, but given that the sun is generally behind me and therefore shining on the screen, sometimes it's just impossible to see what the camera sees. Is it worth discussing camera zoom again just here? As I said in part 1, ignore digital zoom, but if you have a camera capable of optical zoom, that's great, because now you are able to replicate what your eye sees from the cockpit. If you buy a standard SLR, if such a thing exists nowadays, it will probably come fitted with a lens of focal length of about 50mm. This is because this setup replicates what the human eye sees. A standard action cam has a focal length much shorter than this, about 18mm, which apart from anything else allows just about everything in front of the lens to be in focus, but creates the illusion that we're much further away from the action than we really are, or were. For example, this is the action cam view of some close formation with my very brave colleague Roland Butter. He looks as if he's in the next county. By contrast, this is the same view of him with me using a camera with a 50mm lens, and is much closer to the truth. As well as closer to his tail, he hasn't got a parachute and he can't see me. It's all about trust. A suction mount. This arrangement gives a better view of the instruments and is ideal for recording flight parameters and some of those unplanned moments of excitement. Various combinations of sucker, mount and extension are possible, but I use ram mounts for everything as they're always mutually compatible and give a lot of flexibility when swapping ideas around. Despite the fact that the canopy is curved, this mount sticks like glue to most of the inside surface. I've set it on the sides and right in front of my face, which isn't a problem since I can see everything I need to see without any difficulty. Where it might be a hazard is in the sudden stop. As I always fly with a helmet, I'm not bothered about whacking the camera with my head. It'll come off pretty easily. The camera, that is, not mine. Okay, right, moving swiftly on. Mounting on the bulkhead. This can give another view of the instruments, but depending on the camera's focal length, can get more of my head in the shot than I really want, or you really want. Some experiment is needed to get the best from this mounting point, but it has the advantages of fit and forget. I have one installed with a power lead from the aircraft electrics, so I can leave it on a continuous loop record, so I'll always have the last 10 minutes of events on film if anything dramatic happens. A chest mount, clips on the shoulder harness, all that kind of thing. Advantages here are ease of control, and my little pink body with all that squidgy stuff inside provides a lot of vibration absorption. I and the camera get a full view of the instruments, and it doesn't get in the way of flying the aircraft. However, because it's not a solid mount, it tends to follow my body movements a little, which can be a bit distracting, but is useful for getting all that B-roll of the circus performers giving each other light-hearted abuse without noticing me and the camera quite as much. I've given up with helmet-mounted cameras because of the constant switching of the point of aim. I think one principle of filmmaking is to keep the camera fairly still and let the subject do most of the moving. Whip pans, left to right, back again, aren't easy to watch unless we as the producer want to generate a lot of excitement. This is too easy to forget when the camera's fixed to your head. How about the mouth grip option? I saw this online and I thought it's worth a try. It's pretty close to an instrument of medieval torture actually. After about 2 minutes you'll feel as if your jaw's about to fall off. I'm sure it has its place, but not in my cockpit. The results of enduring the pain aren't really worth it, as you might agree from watching this. It isn't enjoyable. Panel mount. This is the selfie mount option and can be extended using another arm to take in more of the scene above the canopy edge. You need to take care with this option because you don't want to be hitting it with your face in a sudden stop. I put a quick release connector on this to get the camera out of the way easily if necessary. This is probably a good time to talk about image stabilization. Most action cams, even the cheaper ones, now have this feature and it seems to work well. We can certainly tell the difference to the footage if it's in use. As with most things, if you pay a little more you get better performance, and here are some examples. It's also possible to reduce the effect of camera vibration in post using software, but better to try to avoid it in the first place by isolating the mounting point from the effects. Where things get more difficult is if we want to film ourselves against an interesting background, a view from the aircraft that's unusual and external, or other subjects without getting the cockpit internals or a bug-spattered canopy in the way. The SD1 is able to accommodate quite a number of external mounts without the usual constraints of legal approval, at least that's in the UK, so that's a bonus. That said, some locations aren't ideal, mainly from the standpoint of airframe vibration. The lightweight structure isn't very good at dampening engine-related buzzing, and I found that high engine RPM or high speed creates enough shaking to make recorded footage almost unusable. The best power and speed combination seems to be about 28 to 2950 RPM and 70 to 75 knots, but that's just for my aircraft obviously. Most mid-range, expensive and some of the budget cameras offer the option of Wi-Fi control. Wonderful, if it works, and my experience suggests that it isn't reliable, and that's putting it diplomatically. Having tried this out with every Wi-Fi enabled camera I've used, even the expensive ones, it isn't reliable enough to be used as the normal means of control. Either the connection fails within minutes or never kicks in at all. So if you've mounted your camera out of arm's reach, you're stuffed. Here are just a few of the external mounting options I developed for the Minisport. The front of the fin. Obviously this gives a good forward view, but the wide angle of the lens produces a bit of a distortion of the wing shape. This can be corrected to some extent in post-production. Attachments by zip tie, so easy to put on and easy to remove. Fuselage behind the canopy. The view aft is uninteresting mainly, and the view forward just emphasises my thinning hair. I've taken it off. The mount, not the toupee. Fuselage forward of the cockpit. A good forward view, and the rear screen sometimes allows me to see what the camera is seeing. There's selfie potential here too, and the mount's got a 360-degree turntable attachment to alter the view left or right during a pre-flight setup, but clearly I can't reach it once the canopy's shut. It's bolted through the fuselage skin, avoiding the fuel tank. It was originally just a standard adhesive mount which had proved adequate elsewhere on the aircraft. Unfortunately, I hadn't taken into account the effect of a hot sun on the adhesive and a heavier camera. What you see here is a rather expensive GoPro camera just before it took the short way home. Fuselage side. This is the replacement for the inspection hatches on the starboard rear and centre, which gives good views of what's happening behind the aircraft and can also be rotated to look forwards. It's mounted on small rubber bobbin mounts to kill some of the vibration of the fuselage skin, which can be seen here. The centre hatch seems to vibrate far more than the one on the tail, probably because the structure isn't as rigid there. This cheap camera has lost the ability to run from its internal battery, so I've run a power source from the cockpit. The unintended benefit of this is that I can run the unit on a continuous loop record. This allows me to get pictures of landings which otherwise would generally occur after the battery had run out of puff. The upper wingtip. This again gives a variable view depending on the turntable adjustment. This is a stick-on mount, so it only gets used for cheap cameras, which are also very lightweight, so won't generate enough leverage to break the mounting and depart the aircraft. If I'd thought about it during construction, I'd have fixed a spreader plate inside the wingtip and bolted the mounting in place. What you might call an extending wingtip boom. It's a carbon fibre rod. It's got about 8 sections to it, obviously infinitely extendable, down to about 2 meters. This allows for a selfie type shot that doesn't appear to have an attachment to the aircraft if you use a 360 camera. There's potentially a lot of leverage in play with this one, so the inner part of the wingtip has load spreaders, and I only use the heavier cameras on the short boom, though it can be extended, as I said, to 2 meters ahead of the wing. There's potentially a lot of flex in the arm, so I limit the airspeed and manoeuvre during filming to keep the footage more stable. A cheap lightweight camera will perform well enough with a 2 meter extension, but a heavier, more expensive unit needs a shorter arm, even with its image stabilisation ability. It does shake about quite a bit. Lower wing leading edge. This can give a 180-degree view forwards and backwards and through the vertical. Again, stick-on mounting for lightweight units. Any mount underneath the aircraft has the potential to capture some great shots of the scenery, the aircraft's shadow and some of the more interesting landings. They're more vulnerable to dirt and damage, of course, so I always put them in a waterproof cage. Clearly, given the lack of remote control, the cameras must be positioned at the right angle and set to run prior to engine start, and whatever gets captured after that can only be controlled by the positioning of the aircraft. This is a huge subject in itself, involving the knowledge of the camera's settings, and we might have more than one camera fitted, the likely position of the subject, the angle of elevation of the light source, the speed of the camera ship, which generates more or less vibration. Then there's the focal length of the lens, which determines what's in focus and how far away it looks, how long the battery will last. I could go on forever. Of course, one great way to get video of yourself is to persuade someone else to carry the camera. To save a lot of wasted time though, it's probably best to set things up yourself so you know where to fly to get yourself in shot. All you have to do then is hope the camera ship can behave himself. This really revolves around a detailed plan of action and always a pre-flight briefing of any other aircraft involved. Here's an example of a misunderstanding and some wasted time. Since on this occasion we hadn't had time to agree the sequence, when Oscar Zulu joined me I briefed him to overtake on the left. He was treating me as the formation leader, so did exactly as I'd asked him to do. My intention was to put him on the left because the cameras were all pointing that way and out of sun, and I would fly an echelon on his right. This is what actually happened, and I never caught him up. Generally though, if everyone involved understands the aim and is competent to fly as required, it only needs the camera ship to manoeuvre around the subject to get the best footage. By using the compact camera with its optical zoom, I was able to zoom in enough to give a more accurate version of what I actually saw. This is what I now use for the close formation video and stills. It's not an action cam as we now know them, but a lot more useful if you can plan ahead and sort out the settings in advance. The camera is inside the cockpit, has the ability to be refocused with 50mm or even longer focal length, and can be controlled by a cable release, so I don't need another hand. It's taped to the throttle or sometimes even between my teeth. I can frame the subject using the rear screen and check exposure at the same time, so I can quickly adjust things as we manoeuvre with respect to the light. If there's a one-size-fits-all solution to the problems I've highlighted, it's probably the 360 camera. The 360, when used with the appropriate software, can be the equivalent of several cameras in one package. While it does need some work in post, as fiddling about with a computer, the results are very worthwhile and allow us to tell a story very effectively with only one or two cameras, depending on where in or on the aircraft we might put them. Like all of the more expensive cameras, they offer image stabilization, which helps to mask vibrations through the airframe. I use both the GoPro Max and the Insta360, and I much prefer the software package that edits the raw video from the Insta360 camera. In fact, I couldn't get the GoPro editor to run at all, and their tech department blamed it on my computer, which was utter rubbish. Their advice, that is, not my hardware. And these cameras feature the ability to attach ND filters, so if you see part 1 for the advantages of these, I'll let the results speak for themselves. Basically you get what you pay for, but the money's only well spent if you're prepared to learn how to use them to maximum effect. If you only have the time to learn how to get the best from one type of camera, I recommend, for the ultimate creative flexibility they offer, to invest in a 360 camera of some sort. I'm not an agent for anybody, but I am a convert of that particular piece of technology. It does save a lot of work. The learning curve shouldn't be too steep, given that if you're clever enough to fly an airplane, this is kindergarten stuff and shouldn't take more than an hour to master. The system I prefer allows me to overcome all the limitations I outlined before, but gives me the equivalent of a separate camera operator on board the aircraft, whose lens can capture everything that's happening at the same time, with no effort from me. I can switch it on and ignore it while I get on with the flying, then play around with the results at my desk later on without worrying about crashing into the ground or hitting a body in the air. I can change the point of view pretty much at will, so I can emphasize the subjects I'm discussing much more easily. This might not usually be of major importance to you, but on the day when or if it all goes wrong, it might be a valuable source of information. Filming formation flying is also much easier since I can select my viewpoint later. This allows me the freedom to act as the lead aircraft and direct the wingman and do all the other stuff that lead is responsible to do, while letting the 360 lens collect all the evidence. In part 2 of this series then, we've examined some of the ways we can mount cameras in or on the airframe, which will, clearly, hopefully, affect the quality of what we capture. The SD-1 is able to accommodate quite a number of external mounting points without compromising the aircraft's performance. That said, some locations aren't ideal, mainly from the standpoint of airframe vibration. A lightweight structure isn't very good at dampening engine-related vibrations, so we need to choose some means of reducing the effects of that, perhaps by limiting RPM and speed, or using units that have some inbuilt stabilization and the ability to overcome the design problems of the budget cameras. In part 3, we'll look at some considerations for stills photography using the same cameras and the same mountings, and some thoughts on audio recording.
Tango India Victor Victor, Orlando Radio. Very good afternoon to you. We're using Robbie 25 on left hand, QNH 1022.
Part 4 will be some suggestions for honing navigation skills, and Part 5 will look at how we might get our friends involved in some flying fun. So if you've lost your mojo in the miserable months, maybe these will get it back. Thanks for watching. See you in Part 3. Bye.